The clinking of cutlery against porcelain echoed in the dining room like a quiet drumbeat of dread. My family had gathered around the long mahogany table, polished so perfectly that it reflected the chandelier's glow above us. The air was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine, yet none of it managed to disguise the tension that hung between us. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table, as he always did, a king surveying his reluctant subjects. My mother, Clara, sat beside him, stiff and silent, her eyes fixed on her plate as though avoiding his gaze might shield her from his words. My brother, Daniel, lounged comfortably in his chair, wearing the smug smile of a man who knew he could do no wrong. And then there was me, Eva, the outsider, the one who never quite fit into the carefully curated picture of success this family loved to parade. Richard's voice cut through the quiet clatter, sharp and merciless. "Ava," he said, not even bothering to soften the steel in his tone, "do you ever stop to think about the choices you make, or the embarrassment you bring upon this family?" His words were loud enough that the servants, shuffling discreetly in the background, glanced up before quickly lowering their eyes again. My fork froze midway to my mouth. I could feel the heat of Daniel's gaze, the slight curl of his lips as if savoring what he knew was coming next. My mother shifted in her seat, but her silence was its own kind of complicity. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, but I forced myself to lift my chin, meeting my father's glare with a steadiness I barely felt. "You are a huge disappointment to us." The words fell like a hammer, shattering whatever fragile peace had remained in the room. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cruelty was in the certainty, the conviction, the way he looked at me as though I were nothing more than a mistake he had been forced to endure. Daniel's smirk widened, his fork spearing a piece of meat with exaggerated satisfaction. My mother's knuckles whitened as she clutched her napkin in her lap, but still, she said nothing. I could feel the sting of tears rising, burning at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying would have been victory for him. Crying would have confirmed every one of his words. I set down my fork, the sound of metal against porcelain sharper than I intended. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, as every pair of eyes settled on me. My chest tightened, my hands trembling under the table. But in that trembling there was also defiance. I thought of all the years I had tried to win his approval. The endless lectures, the punishments for not being as perfect as Daniel, the constant dismissal of my dreams. Something inside me broke then, but it was not weakness. It was the shattering of chains I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I leaned forward slightly, meeting Richard's eyes with a steadiness that startled even me. "Since I'm such a big disappointment," I said, my voice low but firm, "then go ahead and remove me from your will." The words seemed to slice through the air, heavy and irretractable. For a moment the entire room froze in stunned silence. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate, his smirk vanishing as his jaw dropped open. My mother's eyes shot to mine, wide with shock, her lips parting as though to beg me to take the words back. And Richard, my father, he simply stared, his face a mask of disbelief, his lips pressed into a thin line as though he had been struck across the face. His power had always come from control, from our fear of him, and in that moment, I had ripped that power away with nothing more than a sentence. My heart thundered, but I didn't falter. I couldn't. "Eva," my mother whispered finally, her voice trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. It wasn't a reprimand, nor was it support. It was the sound of a woman terrified of what my words had unleashed. Daniel was the first to recover, his voice dripping with venom. "You really don't know when to shut your mouth, do you?" he sneered, glaring at me as though I were the one who had committed the unforgivable sin. I ignored him. My eyes never left my father's face. His expression hadn't shifted, but the silence was louder than any explosion. He had always known how to wound me with words, but for once, it was me who had landed the blow. Richard finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. He didn't speak right away, and the waiting was unbearable. I could feel sweat prickling at the back of my neck, my palms slick under the tablecloth. When he did speak, his voice was calm, almost too calm, and that calmness was more terrifying than his anger. "Careful, Eva," he said softly, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "You don't understand the consequences of the words you throw so recklessly." His warning hung in the air like smoke, suffocating, inescapable, but I held his gaze, refusing to look away. For once in my life, I wasn't the one who flinched first. I thought the conversation might end there, But Daniel couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Honestly, Father, maybe she's right," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Why waste the family's fortune on someone who only brings shame? She doesn't deserve a cent." His words should have stung, but instead, they steeled me. I realized then that Daniel's approval had never mattered, just as Richard's never had. Their wealth, their inheritance, their so-called legacy, it was nothing compared to the freedom of no longer needing them. My mother shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight as tears glistened in her eyes. She looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and something else, something I couldn't yet name. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady as I said, "Maybe you're right, Daniel. Maybe I don't deserve it. But what I do deserve is to live a life that isn't dictated by this table or by him." I gestured toward my father, my chest rising and falling with every word. "And if that means walking away from all of this, so be it." My mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Daniel's face twisted in disgust, but Richard remained motionless, his eyes boring into mine with a darkness that promised this was far from over. The silence that followed was suffocating, but for the first time in years, I could breathe. And in that silence I felt it, the shift. Something irreversible had happened at that table. I had cracked the perfect facade Richard had worked his entire life to maintain, and the fracture was spreading. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The days after that lunch felt like walking through a haunted house where every shadow carried my father's voice. The silence at home was not peace. It was the heavy pause before something breaks. My mother avoided me, her eyes darting away every time I entered a room, as though looking at me reminded her of a truth she didn't want to face. Daniel, on the other hand, became bolder. He'd mutter under his breath as I passed, words like failure and burden, his smirk never faltering. But it wasn't him I feared. It was Richard. My father's silence was far more dangerous than his rage. He didn't scream. He didn't lecture. He simply watched me, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if already planning his next move. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word I had said. I thought about how his face had hardened, how his jaw had clenched just slightly before relaxing into that terrifying calm. What did he mean by consequences? My mind chased the possibilities endlessly. Would he cut me off financially? Erase me from every family record? Treat me as though I never existed? Or was it something deeper, more sinister, hidden beneath his facade of control? The uncertainty gnawed at me, a slow poison dripping into my veins. Yet, despite the fear, a small ember of defiance burned inside me, refusing to die. One afternoon, I overheard Richard speaking in his study. His voice was low but steady, carrying through the half-closed door as he spoke on the phone. "She needs to learn," he said, his tone almost clinical, as if I were an experiment rather than his daughter. "Let her struggle. Let her fall. She'll come crawling back. And when she does, she'll understand her place." The words rooted me to the spot. My breath caught in my throat. My fists clenched at my sides as tears blurred my vision. But I refused to let them fall. Crawling back? No. If he wanted me broken, he would be waiting forever. I would sooner starve than give him the satisfaction of seeing me on my knees. It was then that I started secretly packing. At first, it was just small things. Books, old journals, a few pieces of clothing folded into the bottom of a duffel bag. My room became a battlefield between fear and resolve. Every night I'd sit at my desk, staring at the life I was preparing to leave behind. The framed photos of family vacations, where smiles were staged and laughter was forced, suddenly felt like lies staring back at me. I touched the edges of those frames, and for the first time, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt release. Walking away wouldn't just be an escape. It would be a declaration that I belonged to myself, not to him, not to them. But freedom has its price, and mine was loneliness. I had no allies in that house. My mother's silence was her shield, but to me, it felt like betrayal. Every time she looked at me with those pleading eyes, as though begging me not to provoke Richard further, I wanted to scream. Why didn't she stand up? Why didn't she stop him? And Daniel, his cruelty was his currency, and I was his favorite investment. He reveled in my isolation, in the widening rift between me and the rest of them. Yet, despite their weight pressing down on me, I clung to the one truth Richard could never erase. I had finally spoken. I had shattered the illusion, and even if I stood alone, I stood on my own terms. The breaking point came a week later, when Richard summoned me to his study. His office smelled of leather and old books, the walls lined with shelves that towered above his desk, like judges in a courtroom. He gestured for me to sit, his movements calm, precise, unnervingly controlled. I lowered myself into the chair, my palms sweating, my pulse loud in my ears. For a long time, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a predator deciding when to strike. Finally, he leaned forward, folding his hands. "You think you've proven something," he said quietly, "but what you've proven is how unprepared you are for the world. Without this family, you are nothing. Do you understand?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand. Every instinct told me to nod, to submit, to avoid the wrath lurking beneath his calmness. But then I remembered my words at the lunch table. I remembered the silence that had followed, the way he had faltered for the first time. So I lifted my chin and said, "Maybe I am nothing to you, but I'd rather be nothing on my own than be everything under your control." His eyes narrowed, and a flicker of something, rage, maybe fear, crossed his face before disappearing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally he leaned back, a cold smile curving his lips. "Then leave," he said. "Walk out of this house, and don't expect to walk back in." I expected the words to crush me. Instead, they set me free. My heart pounded wildly, adrenaline flooding every vein, but beneath it was a strange calm. I stood, my legs trembling but steady, and said, "Gladly." His smile faltered, just slightly, and in that moment, I realized something important. His power had never been real. It was a cage built from fear, and I had just unlocked the door. As I turned to leave the room, I could feel his eyes burning into my back, a promise of battles yet to come. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Leaving that house felt like stepping off a cliff with no parachute. I had no plan, no destination, only the duffel bag I'd been secretly packing and a determination so raw it made my chest ache. As I walked down the long driveway, the house loomed behind me like a fortress I had just escaped, its windows glowing faintly in the night. Part of me expected Richard to storm out, to drag me back inside, to prove that my freedom was only an illusion. But he didn't. The silence behind me was absolute, and for the first time in my life, the absence of his voice felt like victory. My legs carried me forward, trembling but relentless, into the unknown darkness. The streets were nearly empty, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights that buzzed faintly against the night air. I had nowhere to go, and that truth pressed heavily against me. Friends were scarce. Most had drifted away long ago, unable to withstand Richard's controlling shadow over my life. The few who remained were already consumed by their own worlds, and I couldn't bring myself to beg for space on their couches. I walked for what felt like hours, the weight of my bag digging into my shoulder, the city both vast and suffocating at once. Every step was freedom, but every step was also loneliness. It felt like being both born and buried in the same night. By dawn, exhaustion caught up with me. My feet ached, my back throbbed, and the adrenaline that had fueled me was fading fast. I found myself sitting on a bench near the bus station, my body shivering from the chill that clung to the early morning air. Around me, the city was slowly waking up, vendors opening carts, buses roaring past, strangers brushing shoulders in a hurry to be somewhere. For the first time, I realized I wasn't a daughter anymore, at least not in the way I had been. I was just another face in the crowd, nameless, unimportant. Strangely, that thought both terrified and liberated me. No one knew me here. No one expected anything from me. I could become anyone. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone. My inbox was empty, save for one unread message from Daniel. My heart skipped as I opened it, half expecting venom. Instead, it was worse. "Dad says good riddance. Don't come back." Short, sharp, and cruel. My chest tightened as I stared at the words. A part of me had hoped, foolishly maybe, that my leaving would spark some crack in their armor, that my absence would be noticed, that maybe my mother would reach out. But no call came, no text, nothing, only silence. The realization stung, not because I wanted their love anymore, but because it confirmed the truth I had been afraid to face. They had erased me the second I walked out the door. Still, I refused to let their silence define me. I had left behind a prison, yes, but I hadn't yet found a home. With what little money I had, I bought a bus ticket to the next city over, the destination chosen not by reason, but by instinct. As the bus rumbled forward, I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur past. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, but there was something new there too. A spark I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was courage, maybe it was desperation, or maybe they were the same thing, two sides of the same blade I was now carrying inside myself. Either way, it would have to be enough. When the bus finally stopped, I stepped into a city that felt both alien and alive. Skyscrapers towered above me, their glass surfaces catching the morning sun, while streets pulsed with energy. The chaos of it all was overwhelming, but somewhere beneath the noise, I felt a strange pull, as if this was where my new life could begin. I wandered aimlessly for hours, my stomach growling, my body begging for rest, until I stumbled upon a small cafe tucked away on a side street. Its warm glow and the smell of coffee drew me in like a beacon. I bought the cheapest drink on the menu and sank into a corner seat, my bag at my feet, my heart heavy, but still beating with defiance. It was there, in that cafe, that I first met Lena. She was the kind of person you noticed immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated it effortlessly. Her laughter rang across the room like music, her presence filling the space with warmth. She was working behind the counter, balancing orders with ease, her eyes sharp but kind. At one point, she caught me staring, and instead of brushing it off, she offered me a smile, a real one, the kind I hadn't seen in what felt like years. It pierced straight through me, softening something I hadn't realized had hardened. For the first time since I left, I felt seen, not judged, not diminished, just seen. When my cup was empty, I tried to leave quietly, slipping past the counter without drawing attention. But Lena stopped me. "Hey," she said, her voice light but steady. "You look like you've been through hell. You okay?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in so long that I almost didn't know how to answer. My throat tightened, words sticking like stones, but I forced a shaky smile. "I'm figuring it out," I said. She studied me for a moment, her eyes searching but gentle, then nodded. "Good," she replied. "Sometimes figuring it out is the bravest thing you can do." And just like that, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I wondered if maybe I hadn't stepped into emptiness at all. Maybe, just maybe, I had stepped into the beginning of something new. The first few days in the city were brutal, a kind of trial by fire I hadn't expected. My small stash of cash dwindled faster than I could count, each coin slipping through my fingers like sand. Food became a luxury, not a certainty, and I rationed every bite as though it were treasure. I found myself sleeping in bus stations or curled in corners of parks, my duffel bag clutched tightly against me like a shield. The nights were the hardest. Cold, endless stretches of silence broken only by the occasional siren or drunken laughter drifting from streets I dared not wander. Fear hung over me like a second skin, but so did stubbornness. I had chosen this path. There was no going back. On the fourth night, hunger drove me back to the cafe where Lena worked. I hadn't planned on returning. It felt shameful, as though she might see through me, see the cracks in my resolve, but the warmth inside drew me in like a promise I couldn't resist. I ordered nothing, just hovered in the corner until she noticed me. Her brow furrowed, and after a moment she brought over a plate of food. No charge. "On the house," she said, sliding it toward me before I could protest. My throat tightened as I whispered a thank you, fighting back tears that burned at the edges of my eyes. Pride and desperation waged war inside me, but the food won. I ate like someone starved of more than just meals. When she sat across from me during her break, I expected questions, suspicion, even pity, but Lena didn't press. Instead, she talked about herself, small things, stories of her childhood, the chaos of juggling work and art school, her dream of opening her own gallery someday. I listened, grateful for the distraction, her words filling the emptiness that had been gnawing at me. For a brief moment, I wasn't Eva, the runaway, the disappointment, the cast-out daughter. I was just a girl sharing a table with someone who didn't demand explanations. And in that fragile hour, I felt almost human again. But reality never stayed softened for long. After closing, Lena offered me a ride on her bike, a rusty thing with squeaking brakes, and as we rode through the dim streets, she asked quietly, "Where are you staying?" Panic jolted through me, and I lied, blurting out, "With a friend." The words felt like gravel in my mouth. She didn't press, only nodded, her face unreadable in the streetlight glow. Yet somehow I sensed she knew the truth. When she dropped me off near the bus station, she looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You don't have to pretend with me." Her words lingered in the air long after she pedaled away. That night, as I tried to sleep on a cold bench, her voice echoed in my head, "You don't have to pretend with me." It was both a comfort and a curse. I wanted to believe her, to lean into the possibility that someone might care without strings attached, but trust was a language I had forgotten how to speak. Richard's voice haunted me still, sharp and unforgiving, reminding me that vulnerability was weakness, that people always used your softness as a weapon. I curled tighter against the cold, whispering promises to myself that I would never let anyone break me again. And yet, deep down, the part of me that craved connection ached unbearably. Days blurred into one another, marked only by exhaustion and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. I searched desperately for work, handing out resumes, begging for shifts in places that barely glanced at me before shaking their heads. My clothes grew rumpled, my body thinner, my spirit stretched thin as thread. Every rejection chipped away at me, feeding the cruel voice in my mind that echoed my father's words, "You are a disappointment." Sometimes I believed him. Sometimes I almost turned back. But each time I saw the image of him at the table, smug and righteous, and it lit a fire in me. I would rather starve on a park bench than crawl back to him in defeat. On the 7th day, everything collapsed. Rain poured relentlessly, drenching me to the bone as I stumbled aimlessly through the streets. My bag was soaked, my belongings ruined, and I had nowhere left to run. I sank against the wall of a closed bookstore, sobbing uncontrollably, the city blurring into a cruel smear of lights and shadows. That was when Lena appeared again, umbrella in hand, her eyes widening as she spotted me. She didn't ask questions, didn't scold. She just crouched beside me, pressed the umbrella into my trembling hands, and whispered, "Come on, enough of this." Her voice was steady, but her grip on my arm was fierce. She didn't give me the chance to resist. Lena led me to her apartment, a tiny studio cluttered with canvases, paintbrushes, and the chaotic beauty of a life lived authentically. The warmth hit me like a physical blow, and I stood there trembling, unable to step inside. "It's not charity," she said firmly, as though reading my thoughts. "It's survival. Everyone deserves that much." Something inside me cracked then. Not completely, but enough. I stepped into her world, dripping water onto her floor, my chest heavy with shame and relief. It felt like stepping into a foreign country where kindness was the language, and I wasn't sure if I knew how to speak it anymore. The first night in Lena's apartment felt unreal, as though I had stepped into someone else's life. I lay on her old futon, staring at the ceiling cracked faintly with lines of paint, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the gentle scratch of rain still hitting the window. My body was sore from days on the street, but the softness of the blanket she had given me was almost unbearable. I didn't know how to receive such kindness. Each time Lena checked on me, bringing tea or asking if I needed anything, I flinched instinctively, as if kindness itself might strike me. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in a haze of exhaustion, fear, and a dangerous flicker of hope. The next morning, Lena treated the situation like it was the most natural thing in the world. She brewed coffee, scrambled eggs in a pan chipped with use, and slid a plate toward me without ceremony. I stared at it, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. My family's breakfasts had always been tense, rigid affairs, Richard reading the paper, my mother serving in silence, each word at the table weighted like a landmine. But here, Lena hummed softly to herself, barefoot in an oversized sweater, moving with a kind of careless freedom that was foreign to me. I picked up the fork with trembling fingers, the food tasting more of safety than anything I had eaten in months. Lena worked most afternoons at the cafe, but in the mornings she painted, her canvases crowding every corner of the apartment. I watched her sometimes, fascinated by the way her hands moved. Sure, decisive, fearless. She painted women with burning eyes, men with fractured faces, cityscapes that seemed alive with grief and beauty. "Painting is how I breathe," she told me once, her brush sweeping in strokes of deep red. I wondered silently what I breathed for. Survival didn't feel like enough. Somewhere inside me, a small, restless voice whispered that I wanted something more than simply existing, more than running from the ghosts of my family's disdain. But what that more was, I couldn't yet name. Trust came slowly, like water seeping into cracked earth. I told Lena little pieces of myself, how I loved books, how I once dreamed of being a journalist, how I sometimes stayed up all night as a teenager just to write stories no one ever read. Her eyes lit up when I admitted that. "Then you already know your voice matters," she said firmly, as though she could decree it into truth. I wanted to believe her. Yet whenever she asked about my family, my throat locked. I muttered vague answers, painting them as distant, cold, but never telling her the full weight of Richard's words or the cruelty hidden beneath our polished name. That shame was mine to carry, and I wasn't ready to let her see how deeply it bled. Still, Lena never pressed. Instead, she gave me space, reminding me with gestures rather than demands that I wasn't a burden. She left notes on the counter. "Help yourself to food. Take the spare key. Don't forget you matter." Sometimes they made me cry when she wasn't looking. For years, I had equated love with condition, acceptance with silence, belonging with obedience. Lena dismantled that piece by piece, not through grand declarations but through small consistencies. It scared me almost more than the streets had, because if I let myself believe in her care, losing it would destroy me in ways I wasn't sure I could survive. Despite the fragile peace, the shadow of my family never left me. Each night, I dreamed of Richard's voice, sharp and relentless, repeating the words that had shattered me. "You are a disappointment." Sometimes I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, convinced I'd see him standing over me. Other times, it was my mother's face that haunted me, her silence, her refusal to intervene, the way she had sat at that table and let me burn under his judgment. Even free of them, their absence pressed in like a vice. I realized with a sickening clarity that running away hadn't erased them. It had only sharpened their grip in my memory. One evening, Lena found me hunched over her small desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook she had left unused. The words poured out of me like a flood I couldn't stop. Fragments of anger, scraps of memory, accusations I could never speak aloud. She read none of it, but her hand on my shoulder was steady. "Write it all down," she murmured. "Spit it out on the page, every poison they fed you. It's not for them. It's for you." For the first time in years, I felt my voice wasn't just echoing inside an empty room. I wrote until my hand cramped, until my tears smeared the ink, until exhaustion pulled me under. And when I woke, the notebook beside me felt like a lifeline. But even as I carved a fragile place in Lena's world, I couldn't shake the looming dread that it was temporary. The city felt too small to hide forever. My father's influence stretched further than I wanted to admit, and whispers of him haunted me in every newspaper headline, every stiff-suited man who passed me on the street. Lena noticed the way my shoulders tensed when certain names came up, though she never pushed. Still, I wondered how long this fragile shelter could hold against the storm I had left behind. And more terrifying than that, what would happen when that storm finally found me? The notebook became my confession booth. Each page carried pieces of a truth I had never dared to voice aloud, letters I would never send, apologies I would never receive, questions I no longer expected answers to. I wrote to Richard in long, seething paragraphs that bled rage and sorrow in equal measure. I wrote to my mother, to the girl I used to be, to the silence that had swallowed me whole. Every night, I sat at the desk with Lena's music playing softly in the background, and I emptied my soul onto paper. The words came jagged at first, then smoother, and soon they began to shape something more than grief. They shaped me. One evening I read a passage aloud to Lena, my voice trembling as I reached the part where I described the lunch, his exact words, my exact answer, the stunned silence that followed. She sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes locked on me, tears brimming but unshed. "That's powerful, Eva," she said softly. "That's not just pain. That's your voice reclaiming its place." I hadn't thought of it that way. To me, it still felt like bleeding. But Lena treated my words like firelight, something to gather around, not run from. And for the first time, I started to wonder if my voice could be more than a wound. Maybe it could be a weapon, or a bridge, or both. But the world has a way of intruding, even when we begin to believe we are safe. One afternoon, while Lena was at work, I returned from a walk to find a white envelope slipped under the apartment door. My name, Eva Marie Hollander, was printed neatly across the front in a handwriting I recognized instantly. My mother's. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard from her in months. My hands shook as I picked it up, torn between the urge to open it and the urge to throw it straight into the trash. The weight of it felt unbearable, as though the paper itself carried every silence, every betrayal she had chosen over me. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I placed it on the desk beside the notebook and stared at it for hours. I wrote about it first, trying to name the flood of emotions it unleashed. Anger, yes, but also longing, and something dangerously close to hope. When Lena came home, I held it up wordlessly, and she sat beside me without speaking. We opened it together. Inside was a single page, written in my mother's slanted script. She didn't apologize. She didn't defend Richard. She simply wrote, "I miss you. I was wrong. I want to see you." And below that, an address and a time. I didn't know how to feel. My chest tightened with the possibility that she might finally see me, not as a disappointment, not as a failure, but as a daughter worth loving. Yet another part of me screamed that this was a trap, that Richard was behind it, that she had only written what she was allowed to write. "You don't have to go," Lena said gently. "You owe her nothing." But I couldn't shake the gnawing pull inside me. I had spent so long running from my past. What if this was a chance, however fragile, to face it on my own terms? Not for them, for me. That night, I wrote her a reply. I told her I would come. I told her I didn't know what she expected, but I needed answers. Needed to see if she meant what she wrote. I didn't sign it with love, just my name. I dropped it in the mail the next morning, feeling like I was sending a message in a bottle into the storm. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. I kept checking my phone even though she hadn't called. Lena noticed my restlessness, but didn't comment. She only reminded me to eat, to breathe, to remember that no matter what happened, I wasn't going through this alone. As the day of the meeting drew closer, I found myself rereading my old writing, searching for pieces of the girl I used to be, the one who still hoped, still believed in the possibility of change. I found her in fragments. In one paragraph I had written, "I am not the sum of what they think of me. I am the sum of what I survive." It startled me, because I had forgotten I believed that once. Maybe, just maybe, I could believe it again. And if my mother truly meant her words, maybe she was trying to survive something too. The morning of the meeting, Lena handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a small sketch, 2 figures on a park bench, one leaning on the other. Below it, she had written, "Whatever happens, you still belong somewhere." I clutched it in my hand as I walked to the bus stop, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what waited for me at that address, but for the first time, I wasn't going there as the girl who had been broken by her family. I was going there as someone who had begun to write herself whole, and that made all the difference. The address led me to a quiet part of town, far from the bustling cafes and offices I was used to. My stomach twisted as I stepped off the bus and found myself in front of a small diner, its neon sign flickering faintly against the gray morning. It wasn't the kind of place I imagined for a reunion. It felt too ordinary, too exposed, as if strangers passing by might glimpse the rawness of what was about to unfold. I stood outside for a full 5 minutes, staring at the door, convincing myself to walk inside. Each breath felt like a countdown. I wasn't sure whether I was walking into healing or another wound. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and fried eggs, the hum of conversation filling the air. My eyes swept the room until they found her, my mother, sitting alone at a booth near the back. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee. Time had carved lines into her face, but her eyes were the same pale blue I had once loved to gaze into as a child. For a moment, I saw not the woman who had abandoned me in silence, but the mother who used to braid my hair before school. My feet moved toward her before my brain had caught up. When she looked up and saw me, her lips parted slightly, as if she were unsure whether to smile or cry. "Eva," she whispered, my name catching in her throat. I slid into the booth across from her, the vinyl seat sticking against my palms. The silence between us was heavy, but not empty. It was thick with years of unspoken words, of letters never sent, of choices that had left scars. "You came," she said, almost in disbelief. "You asked me to," I replied, my voice colder than I intended. Her eyes dropped to her coffee, and she nodded as if she deserved the sharpness. Maybe she did. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I studied her, searching for clues, for cracks in the surface that might reveal the truth of why she had chosen him over me, why she had stayed silent when I needed her most. Finally, she set the mug down, her hands trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something," she said softly. My pulse quickened. I leaned forward, bracing myself. "It wasn't just Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was me too. I let him control me. I let him decide what love looked like. And I'm sorry. I see now how wrong I was. Her words stung because they were true, and truth has a way of cutting deeper than lies. You didn't just let him, I said, my voice shaking. You chose him. Over me. Over your own daughter. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. I know, and I can't undo it, but I need you to understand. He wasn't just cruel to you, Eva. He was cruel to me too. I was afraid every day, but I convinced myself that staying was safer than leaving. By the time I realized what it had cost us, you were already gone. Hearing her admit it felt like both a balm and a wound, healing and reopening all at once. I wanted to believe her. Part of me even did. But the years of silence, of loneliness, pressed hard against my chest. Why now? I demanded. Why reach out now after all this time? She hesitated, then pulled something from her purse. A folded document. She slid it across the table, her hands shaking. I opened it, expecting a letter. But it wasn't a letter. It was a hospital form, a diagnosis. My mother had cancer. The air seemed to collapse around me. She looked at me with eyes full of fear and guilt. I don't want to die with you hating me, she whispered. I need you to know the truth before it's too late. My mind spun. The weight of everything crashed down. Her confession, her illness, the years I had spent learning to live without her. Part of me felt manipulated, as though her sickness was a way to pull me back into her orbit. But another part of me saw her as human for the first time, not as the untouchable mother I had longed for, nor the villain I had blamed, but as a broken woman staring down her mortality. My throat tightened, and tears blurred my vision. I don't hate you, I whispered, surprising myself. I hate what you did, but I don't hate you. Her shoulders sagged with relief, though tears streamed freely down her face. That's more than I deserve, she murmured. I wanted to hold on to my anger, to shield myself from the vulnerability of forgiveness. But sitting across from her, I realized anger had already stolen enough from me. If I clung to it, it would keep stealing. This doesn't fix everything, I said firmly, but maybe it's a start. She reached across the table, hesitating before her hand hovered near mine. Slowly, cautiously, I let her fingers touch mine. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was contact. It was something. When we finally left the diner, the world outside felt strangely brighter, the neon sign no longer flickering but steady, as if even the city understood a shift had occurred. My mother walked beside me, fragile but present, and I realized the story I had been writing wasn't only about pain. It was about survival, about choosing whether to remain chained to the past or begin loosening its grip. Yet as I watched her hail a cab, one thought unsettled me. If Richard knew we had met, he wouldn't forgive her. And suddenly, I wondered if we had both just lit a fuse to a fire neither of us was ready to face. The uneasy peace I felt after leaving the diner didn't last long. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The words chilled me to my core. So, you think meeting her changes anything? You'll pay for this. My stomach dropped. I didn't need a name to know who had sent it. Richard. He had always found ways to invade, to poison, to remind me that he still lurked in the corners of my life. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, a storm rising inside me. He knew. Somehow, he always knew. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, listening to the creaks of the old apartment, every shadow on the wall twisting into his face. My chest tightened as memories of his anger clawed back into my mind. The slammed doors, the venom in his voice, the way he could dismantle me with a single glare. I wanted to call my mother, but what would I say? That I was terrified? That her decision to see me had just painted a target on my back again? I clutched the blanket like a shield, repeating to myself that I wasn't a child anymore, that he couldn't reach me now. But the fear didn't listen. It never did. The next day, I decided to confront the unease head-on. I drove to my mother's apartment, my hands trembling on the wheel the entire way. When she opened the door, her face drained of color. "He knows, doesn't he?" she whispered before I could speak. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. She pulled me inside quickly, locking the door behind us as if that flimsy barrier could keep him away. The air between us was heavy with unspoken dread. "I didn't think he'd find out so fast," she murmured, pacing. "He has people who tell him things." Her voice cracked. "Eva, he's not going to forgive me for this." Her fear mirrored my own, but beneath it, something new stirred. Anger. Anger that, after all these years, he still controlled the way we breathed, the way we lived, the way we loved. "Then let him be angry," I snapped. surprising myself. We're done living under his shadow. If he wants a war, he'll find out we're not the same people he left broken. My mother looked at me, her eyes filling with both pride and terror. You sound just like me when I was younger, she whispered. But I learned the hard way. He doesn't fight fair. He destroys. Her words pressed on my chest, but instead of weakening me, they solidified my resolve. That night, he came, not with fists, but with presence. My mother and I were sitting in the dimly lit kitchen when a sharp knock rattled the door. 3 knocks. Deliberate. My blood froze. Through the peephole I saw him. Older, his hair grayer, but his posture still radiating power. Richard. My body betrayed me, trembling violently, but I forced myself to stand tall. My mother gripped my arm. Don't, she whispered. But something inside me snapped. I opened the door. His smirk was the same as ever, curling with disdain. Well, he drawled. Look at this. Mother and daughter reunited. How touching. His eyes darted to my mother, who shrank back instinctively, then to me. You think you're strong now, Ava? You think she can protect you? His voice dripped venom, but I noticed something I had never seen before. A flicker of weariness in his eyes, a slight slump in his shoulders. He wasn't invincible anymore. You don't scare me, I said, my voice shaking but clear. For the first time, I watched his smirk falter. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You should be careful what you say. Words can cost more than you're willing to pay. But this time it was him trying to regain control, not me surrendering it. The silence that followed stretched thin, a taut wire between us. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling yet resolute. Richard, leave. You don't belong here anymore. Not in my life, not in hers. We're done letting you dictate our futures. Her words seemed to slice the air, sharper than any weapon. Richard's eyes blazed with fury, but he didn't lunge, he didn't scream. Instead, he leaned closer to me, his breath hot against my ear. You'll regret this, he whispered, before stepping back into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkness. The slam of the door echoed like a gunshot. My knees buckled the moment he was gone, and my mother caught me before I hit the floor. Tears poured down my face, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming release of years of silence. For the first time, I had stood up to him. For the first time, he had backed down. Not completely, but enough to feel the shift. My mother stroked my hair, whispering, You were so brave. But I didn't feel brave. I felt cracked open, raw, vulnerable. Yet beneath it all was something I hadn't known was possible. Hope. Maybe his grip was weakening. Maybe the past didn't have to own us anymore. As the night stretched on, my mother and I sat together, too exhausted to speak but unwilling to leave each other's side. I replayed his words in my head, every threat, every glance, but alongside them, I replayed my own. You don't scare me. It wasn't entirely true, but it didn't have to be. Courage wasn't about erasing fear. It was about speaking through it. And as I drifted into uneasy sleep on the couch, one truth anchored me. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, we had drawn our line in the sand. And this time, I wasn't alone. The following days dragged by with an unbearable heaviness, every sound outside our apartment making my heart leap. I started double-checking the locks 3, sometimes 4 times before bed. My mother tried to reassure me, but her hands trembled each time she touched the chain on the door. Richard's presence lingered like smoke, even when he wasn't there. The threat of his return was worse than the confrontation itself, because it left us suspended in fear, never knowing when he would strike. Every moment stretched tight, like the string of a violin about to snap. I began to notice little things. My car moved slightly from where I had parked it. The faint smell of cologne near the apartment hallway, a shadow that lingered too long outside the window before disappearing. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. He was watching us, testing us. My mother confessed one night, her voice cracking. I saw him across the street yesterday, just standing there, staring up. Her words sank like stones into my chest. It wasn't paranoia. It was a countdown, and we both knew it. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, my phone buzzed with a message that made my blood run cold. A photo of me walking to my car, taken from behind. No words, just the image. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I rushed to my mother, showing her the screen, and the color drained from her face. Eva, she whispered, he's escalating. The realization was crushing. He wasn't just trying to intimidate us anymore. He wanted us to know he could reach us whenever he pleased. That no wall, no door, no lock was enough. We debated calling the police, but fear kept us frozen. What would we say? That my estranged father was sending cryptic threats? That he stood outside our building? Without hard proof, they'd dismiss us. And Richard knew that. He always knew how to walk the line just enough to avoid consequences while leaving devastation in his wake. "He's going to force us to make a choice," my mother murmured. "Either we stay silent and endure, or we fight back and risk everything." Her words terrified me because I already knew which path we would have to take. The breaking point came on a stormy Friday night. The rain pounded against the windows as my mother and I sat in the living room, both pretending to watch television, but too consumed by dread to focus. Then, without warning, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. My heart leapt into my throat. The storm outside masked every sound, but I thought I heard footsteps on the stairwell. My mother's hand gripped mine so tightly it hurt. "Ava," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's here." The words sliced through me like ice. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps outside the door. The handle rattled once, twice, then went still. My mother's breath caught in her throat. I clutched the nearest object, a heavy lamp, ready to swing if he forced his way inside. Every second stretched into eternity, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then came the knock, 3 times, just like before, deliberate, mocking. "Open the door," Richard's voice called softly, almost sing-song, like a predator coaxing prey. It's time we had a little family reunion. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was trapped in my chest. My mother shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face, as if begging me not to respond. The door creaked under his weight as he leaned against it. "Eva," he drawled, "you think you're brave now? You think she can protect you? You're both pathetic, and you'll learn, one way or another." His voice carried the same venom as always, but beneath it, I heard something else this time. Desperation, rage, the sound of a man unraveling. And then, as quickly as it began, the sound faded. The footsteps retreated down the hall, swallowed by the storm. My mother collapsed into sobs, clutching me as if to anchor herself to the earth. I sat frozen, gripping the lamp with white knuckles, my breath shallow and ragged. He hadn't forced the door, but the message was clear. Next time, he wouldn't hesitate. The line we thought we had drawn was meaningless to him. My chest tightened as one truth echoed through me like thunder. The final confrontation was coming, and when it did, only one of us would walk away whole. The following Sunday, my mother insisted on something I never expected. She wanted us to go to the family house for lunch. "He won't dare cause a scene in front of everyone," she said, her voice trembling yet resolute. I thought she had lost her mind, but then I saw the determination in her eyes. This wasn't about food or tradition. This was about ending the cycle once and for all. I agreed, though my stomach knotted at the thought. I knew walking back into that house was walking straight into the lion's den, but some battles couldn't be avoided forever. When we arrived, the dining room looked almost exactly as I remembered. Polished mahogany table, crystal glasses catching the light, the faint smell of roasted meat in the air. Yet beneath it all lingered a suffocating tension, like invisible wires stretched across the room. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, his eyes flickering toward me with the same cold contempt as always. My siblings, Daniel and Clara, avoided my gaze, their silence screaming volumes. My mother sat stiff beside me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The meal began in near silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound between us. My appetite was gone, but I forced down a bite just to keep from trembling. Then, midway through, Richard set down his fork with a deliberate clatter, his eyes boring into me. "Eva," he said, his voice low but sharp, "you are a huge disappointment to us." The words sliced through me like knives, but instead of shattering me as they once would have, something inside me crystallized. My pulse steadied, my fear quieted. I looked him straight in the eye. "If I'm such a big disappointment," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "then go ahead and remove me from your will." The table went silent, forks frozen in midair, breaths caught in throats. Richard blinked, clearly not expecting defiance. For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across his face. His lips parted, but no sound came. He had spent his life weaponizing shame and fear, but now, stripped of its power, it collapsed at his feet. My mother's eyes widened, her hand slipping over mine under the table. Richard slammed his fist against the table, rattling glasses, his composure cracking. "You ungrateful," he began, but Clara cut him off, her voice sharp and trembling. "Enough, Dad." Every head snapped toward her. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed. "You think she's the only one you've hurt? You think the rest of us don't carry scars from your cruelty?" Daniel's fork clattered onto his plate as he added, his voice breaking, "We've been silent too long, and we're done." My chest tightened. After years of isolation, I wasn't alone anymore. The room erupted into chaos. Richard's face twisted with fury, but for once, his rage had no ground to stand on. He tried to rise, but Daniel stepped between us, his hands trembling but firm. My mother finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "This ends today, Richard. You don't own us. You don't control us. And if you ever try to hurt Eva again, you will answer not just to her, but to all of us." The weight of her words filled the room like a thunderclap. Richard looked around the table, his kingdom crumbling in real time. The power he had wielded for decades was slipping away, and he knew it. His mouth opened, but no words came. Only silence, the first silence that belonged to us, not him. I realized then that the twist wasn't in him breaking us. It was in us breaking free of him. The man who once seemed larger than life now looked small, cornered, and pitiful. For the first time, I pitied him more than I feared him, and that was the truest victory of all. As we left the house that day, the storm clouds above broke, sunlight spilling across the driveway. My mother squeezed my hand, her voice soft but strong. "You gave us the courage we never had." I looked back at the house, at the man still sitting at the head of his collapsing empire, and felt the final thread of his control snap. We had endured his shadow, but now we walked into the light, together. It didn't erase the scars, but it rewrote the ending, and for the first time in my life I was free. If you enjoyed this intense and moving story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and stories that will captivate you from beginning to end. Turn on the bell to receive all notifications.